Hello, everyone. We welcome you to another episode of the Cosmic Matrix podcast. Once again with your hosts, myself, Bernhard Günther, and my wife, Laura Matsu. And the title of this episode is The Spiritual Warrior's Path of Navigating the Spiritual Realms. It's a very important topic, especially for the times we're in. So we really want to take a deeper look into the hidden forces, the spiritual forces that shape our lives, especially as spiritual seekers or really anyone engaged in psycho-spiritual work. It is important to become aware of and really understand the unseen forces that are influencing our lives, especially right now as we are at the crossroads of humanity. We'll talk about that as well. We're really living in a time where the outer appearance of progress, which is mostly technological advancement, scientific breakthroughs, the illusion of convenience, and it all masks up an increasingly unstable and deceptive and spiritually bankrupt world. There's a spiritual vacuum really emerging, an emptiness inherent in the masses, and that emptiness doesn't stay empty. It's being filled by something else. So many people escape into either religious dogma or get caught up in New Age deceptions. But underlying it all are unseen non-human forces that have manipulated humanity for ages. So any sincere seeker really engaged in this inner work and anyone attempting to awaken or transcend the so-called matrix will be confronted with these anti-divine forces. As one progresses on the spiritual path, hostile forces, demonic entities, adversary forces attempt to interfere, even and especially when one has reached higher levels of consciousness. And that is shown throughout the ages. Even the Buddha, Jesus, Yogananda, Milarepa, Sri Aurobindo, and every other spiritual avatar or spiritual master were confronted with demonic entities and also their own shadow parts, ranging from violent attacks to deceptive temptations, Luciferic temptations. But these were tests to pass, similar to what Rudolf Steiner called the guardian of the threshold. And Sri Aurobindo also noted, quoting him here, "The hostile forces are power of darkness who are in revolt against the light and the truth and want to keep this world under their rules in darkness and ignorance. Whenever one wants to reach the truth, to realize the divine, they stand in the way as much as possible. Especially when there's a great progress, these forces try to interfere." End quote. So many seekers still fail these tests, even on lower levels of consciousness or awakening, because they're simply not aware of it. They either give in to the Luciferic temptations of the New Age false light, or they fall into very rigid religious dogma, which are really two sides of the same deception coin, as I call it, influenced by occult hidden forces. So it is really imperative to learn about these unseen forces and spiritual forces, understand them and see how they especially work through us, not only out there in the world and through others, but through us. In other words, we need a spiritual knowledge of the unseen worlds and occult forces that affect all of us without exception. Ignoring these forces doesn't really protect us from them. Ignorance is not a protection. A lack of this knowledge actually keeps us entrapped in the labyrinth and at the mercy of forces we are not aware of. So really any esoteric spiritual or psycho-spiritual work towards awakening starts with radical self-knowledge, really to know yourself, with sincere inner work, seeing ourselves clearly, without filters, identities, stories, blame or victimhood, excuses, and especially not spiritual bypassing. But that's also not enough. We also need to understand the reality we're embedded in, the hidden architecture behind this physical world, the forces at play beyond what we are told is real, so to speak, according to consensus accepted physical reality, which is kind of steeped in materialism. And also, I would argue complete integral spiritual teaching doesn't only show you the way out, so to speak, right, towards awakening, transcending the matrix or self-realization, but also the dangerous traps and the forces that prevent, interfere with, and also hijack any impulse to awaken. So a complete teaching doesn't only point towards the light, God, and the forces of light, but also presents a clear understanding and cosmology of all forces, including the opposing dark forces, and also the cosmic teaching function of evil, as part of the creation and the evolutionary process, without just externalizing these forces or projecting evil onto others, which most people tend to do. So any teaching that really emphasizes only self-awareness and only self-work, right, without addressing these hyperdimensional influences, or only focuses on the opposite side, on external forces without guiding you into your own shadow and unconscious programs, is incomplete. And incomplete teachings, even when offered with good intentions, can be misleading and even dangerous, especially in times like these, when the hostile forces, the adversary forces, are becoming more active and more deceptive to counteract an awakening. Having said that, despite all the hostile forces and interferences, the forces of darkness, obviously, yes, there are divine forces, angelic beings and archangels guiding, assisting, and supporting humanity's evolutionary process, also us individually, of course. We can draw on them and connect to these benevolent forces as well, of course. Yet, we need to be able to discern them from deceptive imposter spirits. The divine forces, act according to higher divine laws. They act in accordance and in alignment with divine will. They respect free will, also the karmic lessons and trajectories that are way beyond human morality and logic to comprehend. A lot of people also project human morality or human logic on God and don't understand, why God would, quote unquote, allow this or that. But ultimately, we are really in a spiritual war, right? More and more people talk about that we're in a spiritual war. Even many people in the truth and freedom movement and communities talk about this spiritual war. Yet most of them are externally focused, ironically, on the 3D aspects of the matrix and lack an understanding of the spiritual forces that are influencing humanity, institutions, the whole world, but not only externally, but also they are subjected to these forces without their awareness. As it is written in even the New Testament, the Ephesians, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this world's darkness, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms.
Okay, so in today's episode, we're going to outline 6 themes for anyone navigating the spiritual path who wants to engage in inner work, seek truth, understand the matrix, maybe help others also in the process. And we're going to be going through 6 main themes. 1, we're going to discuss the blind spots in both psychology and spirituality. 2, we're going to discuss how the hyperdimensional matrix operates beyond space and time. 3, we're going to talk about how humanity is at a crossroads, which relates to the splitting of humanity. 4, the necessity of facing evil as a path of transformation. 5, how deception can be disguised as light, what other people sometimes call false light. Again, a term that is very often misused. I've even heard people call yoga false light, for example. So we're going to discuss what that means. And then lastly, we're going to discuss the presence of divine forces and how they support us. But first, a little announcement. So we've been running the Embodied Soul Awakening program consistently for about 5 years now. We're going to take a little bit of a longer break to make space for some new projects. Yes, we will return eventually. So you can always go to thetimeoftransition.com if you want to find out when the next one will return. It will return as an updated version, perhaps maybe a little bit longer. So we're going to kind of reevaluate that, rework that, and we're going to also start a couple new projects. And this has been a really profound journey. We've done it through the whole pandemic. It's been very fascinating and really heartwarming to notice everyone's personal stories and transformations and to really hold space for people during these crazy times. But we need a bit of a break from it. And we're going to use this break to start a new chapter of our work, both as individuals and together. So I'm going to focus writing on Substack more. I'm kind of also getting tired of the whole algorithm game of social media. So I really want to shift into long form writing, which has really been always my first love. So if you can join me over at Substack, I'm at lauramatsu.substack.com. I actually released my first article, Reflections on the Spiritual War, last week. I hope to release an article every 2 weeks, but for me, I'm all about quality over quantity. So feel free to subscribe if you want to catch up with me there. And Bernhard also has a new offering to announce as well.
Yeah, so, as Laura just said, one of the reasons we take a break from Body Soul Awakening is kind of reassess. It's gone really well, but we want to take a break from it and then reintroduce it sometime later. But over the past year, I've also had a strong, really persistent call and inspiration to create something new, right? And that speaks really directly to these challenges during this time of transition we are facing, both not only individually, but collectively, and also relates to this topic of this podcast. So I've really, over the past year, followed that voice and worked diligently and deep and created a more advanced initiation into spiritual discernment, so to speak, on sovereignty and also the unseen architecture of reality. And it resulted in a 10-week in-depth live program that will in-depth uncover the invisible forces shaping your life and the world, ranging from collective psychic influences to entity interferences, false light deceptions, and divine guidance, and much, much more. I called it Mastering Spiritual Warfare, Discerning the Unseen Forces and the Path to Embodied Sovereignty. And it will run from June 25th until August 27th. It is, again, limited to 40 participants and by application only. Just started the enrollment, and you can learn more about it and apply at the website masteringspiritualwarfare.com. And with this program, I will guide the core teachings in the majority, but Laura will also provide some of the practices, some of the exercises, and join as a guest teacher here and there as well. So make sure to check it out, masteringspiritualwarfare.com.
Yeah, and you're already about like 1/3 of the way full, I would say, too.
Exactly.
So,
I just opened up a few days ago.
I recommend, if you're interested, to check it out soon.
All right. So let's dive into the first part of this podcast and out of these 6 points, which is the blind spot in psychology, right, and spirituality, both regarding the spiritual forces and entities that are interfering with us. So in modern psychology and mainstream, also even mainstream spiritual teachings often show a very strong blind spot when it comes to acknowledging and addressing the influence of non-physical forces, especially adversary forces, hostile forces, entities, and hyperdimensional interference. And these blind spots can actually then hinder a true healing, also even block spiritual discernment and perpetuate all kinds of unconscious manipulation. Now, we know that mainstream psychology is stuck in materialism, right? They tend to reduce all experiences to internal psychological dynamics, be it trauma, repression, projection, or archetypal symbolism, and also even just stuck in the materialism of biology, that any mental issue or mental illness is due to a biochemical imbalance in the brain, right? It's very limited. Obviously, this lens is valuable. You don't want to dismiss it, which we talk about later as well. It's not black and white. But if you're stuck in this materialistic lens of psychology, then obviously dismiss the possibility that some intrusive thoughts, compulsions, or emotions may actually be amplified or even induced by non-physical forces or entities that are not part of your own makeup, psychic makeup, so to speak. On another note, we also know that in academic psychology and psychiatry, genuine spiritual experiences, which can be also very intense, very chaotic, result in psychosis, dissociation, or schizophrenia, and so forth, they're not being recognized. They're just being seen as a pathology or a hallucination or illusion. So there's an
or psychosis.
Or psychosis, exactly. Paul Levy is a good example, who had a breakdown in 10 spiritual experiences, and he was institutionalized. That's where he then came face to face with the topic of Wetiko.
Which relates to the topic of spiritual emergencies, which actually can relate to a genuine spiritual awakening if held correctly, but most of the medical system will just reduce that to some sort of form of psychosis.
Yeah.
Something's gone wrong, when it actually can be an opening to larger forces.
Which is recognized in shamanic cultures. They see that breakdown as actually an initiation into the spiritual world.
Yeah.
Right. So obviously, mainstream psychology lacks a metaphysical and esoteric understanding of the multidimensional reality. And that can leave people also vulnerable to real spiritual attacks, right? Because of ignorance of not, or claiming that these spirits or hostile forces are just hallucinations. Give a good example. A person, for example, experiencing chronic suicidal thought injections may be told it's purely biochemical or trauma-based, which, of course, in some cases that may be the truth. But another issue or cause could be that there's an entity that is feeding off the despair and pushing the individual more towards self-destruction, right? We don't know. So ultimately, without an understanding of occult laws, multidimensionality, and the architecture of the soul, even well-intentioned healing modalities, they simply fall short. Because these therapists or practitioners are unaware of the astral realm, of even thought forms, soul fragmentation, and all kinds of interdimensional parasites, which they just dismiss as part of the person's psychosis.
And to add on to that, there's also people who are like, I am aware of entities, I can remove them for you. There's also that line of work also has its own issues. Not to say that you can't work through these entities on yourself, but to have the idea that someone can just remove it for you and you'll be fine is also not the solution, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, This is a whole nother, we talk about this as well, this entity removal business, which can done a lot of damage, for example, if the person has no psychological knowledge and mistakes a shadow part or really traumatized inner child as an entity, tries to remove it, which results in more fragmentation and psychosis.
Yes. Okay. So there's also this shadow side of everything is a part of you, everything is me form of spirituality. And many modern spiritual paths, especially influenced by non-duality or some New Age teachings like the Course in Miracles, could promote the belief that everything is a mirror and there is no external other, which is basically a form of metaphysical absolutism that makes it taboo to even suggest the existence of hostile external forces or anything outside of you. And this is often used as a spiritual bypass. It can also be a form of solipsism disguised as a spiritual truth. But it really leads to spiritual bypassing, where people then blame themselves for everything while ignoring or denying the existence of entity interference, occult attack, or even interdimensional manipulation. And while I agree that taking responsibility for your projections is an essential aspect of self-work, it's important to not blame everything on yourself. And while I agree that most people don't like to take responsibility for their projections because it can be a very humbling, disillusioning moment, this also can make individuals more vulnerable to manipulation, because if you deny the existence of deception and evil, you won't recognize when it's actually affecting you. And basically, at its core, this type of solipsism is this belief that only your own mind is the thing that exists. Everything is a projection. And classical non-duality teachings does point to the unity of all things, and it still acknowledges there's a paradox of Maya, illusion, and Lila, the cosmic play. This interplay of self and other is embedded into it. It's not all just a projection of your own mind, which is ridiculous. That's to say that Bernhard is just a projection of my own mind and I'm just imagining everything that makes up who he is. That's me being in a narcissistic tunnel vision. Yeah. And basically, in modern misinterpreted terms, this teaching will get weaponized into something like nothing exists outside of me. Every negative event, abusive person, or dark energy is just a mirror of me. And this is really just a spiritually inflated form of solipsism, where it creates this tunnel vision that denies the legitimacy of anything beyond one's psyche. That's not actually true, by the way, is that you have an individual psyche, but you also can connect to a collective realm as well. Other people also have their own psyche experiences. And there's also energies in nature everywhere around us. So to say the whole world is a projection of your own mind is in this tunnel vision, which basically erases the possibility of evil, deception, or even the genuine otherness, that there's a thou, that there's someone else who's in the game with you. To say that it's all a projection of your own mind actually reduces that connection between the self and other. And it's a form of spiritual narcissism, which doesn't mean overt grandiosity. or arrogance, but it manifests more subtly as a spiritual grandiosity, this belief that everything is just a personal message for you, the refusal to consider that other beings, human and non-human, may act autonomously and with hostile intent. And it can also lead to the denial of victimization or even harmful experiences, like you must have manifested this or your vibration attracted it. So this cloaked narcissism really centers oneself as the origin of all causality, which is a really simplistic way to look at things. And it ironically turns spirituality into this narcissistic feedback loop where empathy for others is diminished and everything is reduced to one's own internal processes, which is just not the truth, is that other people have their own internal processes. Nature is alive, is imprinted with all sorts of energy and forms. So it really insulates you into everything is a part of my reality and really leads to some very delusional and sometimes even harmful thinking.
Yeah, it's very the typical spiritual philosophical bypass of the higher spiritual truth that all is one being hijacked by the ego for its own narcissistic identification.
Yes.
Right? Absolutely.
You hear this all the time, by the way.
Yeah. So there's one side. So we see now in mainstream psychology that denies the spiritual force, or in spiritual circles, they are completely lost in their narcissistic, solipsistic bubble, right? Misinterpreting and misunderstanding higher spiritual truths. But there's now also a psychological blind spot in the spiritual community as well, right? Because I've noticed over the years, let's say over the past 20 years, that's been the focus of my work, talking about the hyperdimensional matrix, hidden forces, occult forces, how we are being manipulated, being used as a food source. They work through us, through the institutions, through people. Over the years, this topic I've noticed has become more popular, especially over the past few years, and that's great. But with it, a lot of distortions that I've seen, especially in the spiritual or New Age communities, that all of a sudden people started to blame entities for everything because they lacked the psychological foundation, right? So they've fallen into the opposite trap. They over-spiritualize the inner experience and then prematurely blame entities or external forces for what actually could be trauma-based subpersonalities, their own disowned shadow aspects and parts, or unmet developmental needs of the inner child, right? So this creates a lot of fragmentation, confusion, and ironically makes them more vulnerable to real hostile forces. Here's the paradox. So, that really ties into ultimately spiritual bypassing this necessary psychological work, right? They jump into all this entity topic, entity clearing, psychic defense, and all kinds of energetic protection, visualizations, and all of this without having really done any sincere foundational inner child work or shadow integration, which is key before even getting into the entity topic.
And it's an ongoing process, not something you just read a book or do like for a few months and then you're like, I'm okay.
Yeah. Because and I've experienced this myself and with many people I work with, right? A perceived surge of emotion, very dark emotion, negativity, compulsive behavior, and a very dark, deep critical inner voice could be literally mistaken as a demonic attack and entity attachments when it's actually a trauma protector, right? Or a shamed inner child or a manager part that's trying to maintain control, which we have these shadow parts we have so exiled them into the unconscious, into the shadow, then over time it becomes this raging animal. We cannot even recognize it as part of ourselves. Hence, it feels very foreign, but it doesn't mean that's an external entity, right? But without the psychological knowledge and integration, it leads to blaming entities where there are none. And I've seen this in a lot of people. An external responsibility. A lot of people make also assumptions that they have entities, but you have to have a very high level of being and self-knowledge, understanding of your own psyche and the occult worlds to really be able to make this diagnosis and differentiation and not mistake your own shadow parts or subpersonalities for entities, right? Because trauma creates split-off parts of the psyche that also carry intense emotional energy. They may even speak in different voices, right? We have all these different subpersonalities and sometimes feel even alien or overwhelming, right? This is very well documented in depth psychology or modalities like internal family system or even Jungian active imagination working with archetypes and all that.
Psychosynthesis. I think I would argue that most complete psychological teachings acknowledge the existence of subpersonalities. It goes beyond IFS.
Even Gurdjieff talked about this 100 years ago, all these different I's, the false parts of the self, which conflict within ourselves, are very paradoxical, even have paradoxical desires, needs, and wants, and all of that, right? But if there's lack of psychological knowledge, lack of psychological self-awareness, and lack of core psychological concepts, then a spiritual seeker may interpret these trauma parts as entities, as parasitic entities, right? Especially if these parts express all kinds of rage, despair, anger, suppressed sexual desires, hatred, all of that. So instead of compassionately engaging with or integrating these parts, then they may try to cast them out, to exorcise them, right? Which is the worst part you can do. One of the worst things I've seen time and again is people, especially people who may offer entity removal modalities, they have no psychological awareness, understanding, even clairvoyance. They may misinterpret a shadow part of a person or traumatized subpersonality part of a person for an entity, and hence trying to exercise it, remove it, which will over time result in more psychosis and fragmentation, because that part needed compassionate inquiry to be integrated, not cast out. So that's really the big danger when there's lack of psychological knowledge within oneself.
So this can also lead to demonizing or further exiling the wounded inner child. I think it was Robert Johnson I think it was known as Robert Bly. And he said in his book, The Little Book of the Human Shadow, that any part of ourselves that we do not love will become hostile to us. So a lot of us learn to exile our more vulnerable, spontaneous, playful parts because we were shamed for those parts. Maybe we were abandoned. We were expected in childhood to put on a certain mask of a false self in order to gain approval. And then these inner children become exiled from us. They grow up in the wilderness, and they become very hostile to us. They become very wild and unintegrated when they pop up, when we get triggered, and they can feel like some sort of entity attack, but it's really just a very wounded inner child who's not very civilized because we haven't integrated into our conscious awareness. So we need to make sure that we don't label these wounded inner child, which are essential to be held with compassion, to be loved, to be heard, to be understood, as some sort of entity, and further exile the most essential part of ourselves. Because healing the inner child, I feel, is crucial to spiritual evolution, even if you look at it through the soul lens, a psychological lens, a spiritual lens. From a soul perspective, your inner child is really a connection to the divine. So this is really important because you don't want to reinforce this fragmentation and being cut off from the most spontaneous, innocent part of you that has a connection to the divine, and then hate that part because it's hostile or angry, like an abandoned child would be. And then this can also lead to overly paranoid thinking. So without this psychological insight, seekers can develop a type of spiritual paranoia. They see entities everywhere. They may think that they're constantly being stalked by them. They can believe others are sending them dark energy. You can make up all sorts of stories around this. And it's really stemming from a form of hypervigilance where you're constantly looking for things out there that are trying to get you. And it's a reaction to the nervous system's trauma response, and except being read through a metaphysical lens. So without grounding in both somatic, emotional work, psychospiritual self-work, these spiritual practices can disembody you and amplify your own delusion rather than act as a tool for truth and clarity. And then ultimately, one of the things you've probably heard us talk about on many of the podcasts, but personal responsibility is really a key aspect to reversing the energy field. It doesn't mean that you're responsible for everything in this world, in this solipsistic worldview, but to understand that you have agency, you have choice in this world, you can do what you can to change your situation. And we can see that with blaming entities for everything, it becomes the ultimate spiritual defense mechanism, because instead of being responsible for one's own choices, patterns, or issues, it's just an entity, and then it becomes this magical thing that sometimes you also can't get rid of in many people's view. It's just this entity that's affecting you. So instead of asking what is it in me that create an opening for this interference, because it tends to take into your own traumas, shadows, blind spots, and wounds, it turns to something is attacking me, and it creates this victimized stance, which disempowers healing. And real spiritual maturity involves discerning what is internal and what is external, and not using any model, whether it's entity model, even shadow work, to bypass your own inner psychological and emotional work, while also being aware of this aspect of self and other, that it's not all a projection of your own mind, and to take responsibility for what you can, and to also be able to acknowledge that there's other things that affect you besides your own psyche.
Yeah, so that's really what it comes down to. That's what I would argue or define as the essence of psycho-spiritual work, right? To combine the spiritual aspect with spiritual forces, the soul aspect, and other forces that can interfere and attack us that are not part of our psyche, so to speak, but combine it with the in-depth psychology, grounded shadow work, inner child wounding, trauma work, and all of this to bring it all together in a more holistic, integral way, so to speak. Now, let's go into the second topic, and this, just briefly giving an overview of the hyperdimensional matrix, the macro perspective of the hyperdimensional matrix that operates beyond space and time. And that's something people who are familiar with my work, written about, talked about over 20 years, right? You can find it on my website, veilofreality.com. But it becomes more and more important to be aware of it. Because as I mentioned in the introduction, a lot of people talk about this is a spiritual war, but most people, especially in the truther movement, freedom movement, they're still caught up in the tunnel vision of the 3D manifestation of the matrix. As I always call this, shadows on the wall, like in Plato's allegory of the cave, right? They focus on corrupt governments, the left or the right, media propaganda, big pharma, the deep state, the globalists, the World Economic Forum, central banks, or secret societies, Zionists, whoever they want to blame, right? But again, it's like fighting shadows in Plato's cave, mistaking these projections for the source, because the true architects of the matrix, as been also known throughout the ages in all different esoteric occult teachings, they are non-physical hidden forces. They are very ancient beings. They're strategic, they're highly intelligent, and they operate across millennia. And these hyperdimensional beings work through human puppets. They use the human puppets as quote-unquote agents, most often without the person's awareness, and they have done so for thousands of years to shape culture, belief systems, religions, and global structures, right? But you have to understand, they don't think in human terms. We have to get out of our human way of logic, thinking, and all of this, because their perception of time is not linear or limited to a single lifetime, right? Some of these beings span centuries, even millennia, ages, eons, and they have all the patience and strategy and persistence. So when one plan fails, they adapt, they wait, they try again, often through new vessels, right? So you have to understand they're beyond death in a sense they don't die, right? They don't exist in a physical body. They simply transfer hosts, continuing their influence. That's why I've written an article about this, the futility of cheering when a quote-unquote evil person dies, or trying to kill all the pedophiles, all the evil people, because whoever was hostile force, azuric entity, or even demonic entity was working, using this person as a vessel, or even possessing them. When the vessel dies, okay, just moves on, goes to the next one, right? Sri Aurobindo talked about this, even the futility of capital punishment and death penalty if somebody is killed who is maybe possessed by such a being. The being is not affected. It will just move on to another host, right? So there needs to be a different approach. We need to understand these hidden forces. So ultimately, this hyperdimensional matrix traps humanity in an ancient divide and conquer program, right? It's all about pitting humans against humans, left versus right, race versus race, class versus class, religions versus religions. That's a whole history of humanity. We know that. It keeps people reactive, externalized, and totally blind to the non-physical manipulation. And these orchestrated divisions, which we see very prevalent nowadays, again, generates luge, which is the emotional and vital energy harvested by these hyperdimensional entities who feed on fear, hatred, rage, and suffering. That's really what it comes down to. Humanity is not on top of the food chain, and we are being held in this quote-unquote frequency prison to provide the luge for these entities. And because they operate also through the lower nature of humanity, right? Be it greed, fear, just lower desires, control, all of that, need for power, they easily gain traction inside of us through these unconscious drives, the temptation to make traps of agreements. That's their grip, right? The spiritual light, the divine forces, by contrast, they work through conscious alignment. They don't coerce, it respects free will, and until a person is willingly turning towards the light, the divine doesn't even interfere much in the collective, except through a few awakened individuals maybe who serve as catalysts for the shift. But we need to have a conscious aspiration towards the divine. And then we'll talk about this also in the second hour, how the divine forces counteract the hyperdimensional manipulation. But I also want to be very clear, because people have abused this topic as well. It's not black and white, right? It's very nuanced. There are also positive, benevolent forces even within the system of government and institutions, right? Again, it's not black and white, because you too are influenced by these occult forces from the lower to the higher realm. We all transducers of these forces through the porosity of mind, right? Or any entry points, and also based on your level of consciousness. So which leads us to the next point of this podcast, humanity at a crossroads, the splitting of humanity. We have talked about this in past episodes before. I've written articles about it, but bringing it up again in context of this episode right near here and the hyperdimensional matrix and hidden spiritual forces, because it's becoming more relevant, especially nowadays. There's an undeniable splitting of humanity going on that's way beyond politics. It's not about left versus right or religious ideologies or social change, but it's more about a path that leads to a deeper spiritual awakening, soul embodiment, and divine alignment. And the other one descends more into disembodiment and cold materialism and transhumanistic control. So we are really in an epoch, so to speak, where we must choose consciously. Right, we talked about this before in a few past episodes ago about our Atlantean and Egyptian karma. So similar to that, we can easily now abuse technology again and go down the wrong path, so to speak. Right, many are already being lulled by comfort, technological comfort and convenience, into the path of least resistance and also soul disembodiment. I call it the epidemic of the 3Ds: disembodiment, dissociation, and dysregulation. So the forces of materialism, which already Rudolf Steiner warned about over 100 years, that will overtake humanity more and more. The forces of Ahriman, the Ahrimanic beings and spirits, they will attempt to paralyze spiritual growth in humanity. Right? Even Steiner talked about this over 100 years ago, and we're seeing that now that medical procedures will be developed to block spiritual inclinations, making even people physically resistant to spiritual awareness. We see this with big pharma, psychiatric drugs, but obviously also with the vaccine, right? As Steiner literally said, the soul will be abolished through a medicine, and a vaccine will be created that removes spiritual tendencies already in children. So we can see that happening already, even more increasingly. And the goal is really to create a population that only acknowledges physical science and materialistic forces. And then we see this, the grip of materialism, even nowadays more and more. Everything will be interpreted through a mechanistic biochemical lens, and human consciousness will be just reduced to brain chemistry and neural networks, denying really the existence of a soul. And as we see now with AI, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, transhumanism will actually be seen as the main way to improve human existence, right? Almost replacing the need for spiritual growth. So that's the apparent need for spiritual growth. So that's where the temptation lies in all of that, right? Again, vaccines, pharmaceuticals will be used for that end as well. And that ties into the hyperdimensional takeover of body and mind, because the more you use these artificial means to alter the body, the more the soul will almost reject the body, will be ejected, so to speak, disconnected from the body. And that creates entry points of vacuum, which these entities use and come in to take possession or control of a body. That's really what I've always been calling the alien invasion through our bodies. So
yeah, let's discuss how the spiritual side manifests in this splitting of humanity. I think about this a lot. Are we really priming ourselves for a collective spiritual awakening or not? I think that there is a lot more people being drawn to psycho-spiritual growth. The reason that we really align with psycho-spiritual growth, because we find that spiritual teachings can be used for spiritual bypassing. So the psychological part of it helps us understand the soul aspect of it too. And it also leaves us less vulnerable to using spiritual teachings for spiritual bypassing. I have to say, while I do see more people interested in psycho-spiritual topics, there's been also an increase in deceptive teaching. So especially with Pluto and Aquarius, we're going to see all sorts of like new age cults pop up even more than before. People looking for like shortcuts or ways to like get enlightened really quick and transcend into 12T, et cetera, right? But there has been some sort of collective disillusionment that led people to asking deeper questions. Because of what's happened during COVID, there's been an increased distrust in institutions like public education, mainstream medicine, mainstream science. There's been a push towards more alternative ways of healing, of knowledge, holistic medicine, living off grid, growing your own food, and natural approaches to the body and mind are obviously becoming more popular as people reject this materialistic worldview. I think that also we're going to move away from these huge communities into these small spiritual communities and hubs, which will replace the reliance on the mainstream system. So this will be a type of decentralization, which is, by the way, why I'm attracted to Substack, because it's more of a smaller, more sincere community, it seems. So we're going to see these little micro communities of people who are living outside of the norms. I don't think it's going to be like this mass thing, but we'll see masses of micro communities who will be offering alternatives to the consensus worldview. And just, I think, because of the suffering that's come up, either you decide to disassociate further, disconnect from yourself further, or you use the suffering as a catalyst to being drawn to your own healing and inner work, which I think many people, especially listening to this podcast, have done. It makes you ask deeper questions about yourself, the world, and start to look within. So we are going to see new ways of learning, of educating, of healing outside of mainstream control. And I really think this is going to be a huge theme of Pluto and Aquarius, is like you won't see so much like mass movements of millions of people, but you're going to see little pockets of alternative communities where people are going to be thinking differently. They're going to raise their children differently. There's going to be new forms of education, especially with Uranus entering Gemini soon. And also maybe a way outside of this materialistic mindset where we can start to teach ourselves and maybe our children psycho-spiritual principles, and we get out of this idea, this basically ideology of scientism, which has really turned into an ideology rather than a form of curiosity and understanding the world. And it's going to be an actual process. It's not going to be black and white. People will be drawn to each other or repel each other based on levels of consciousness, which I think is a general, or more a loose rule. But you're going to see that people, even I noticed in myself, like I used to be able to maintain before COVID relationships that were more shallow, or maybe based on a false self. But because of what's happened over the past 5 years, I've changed so much that I really can't maintain those connections anymore, because the false self who maintained those connections is no longer there, basically. So there's going to be a natural splitting in context of the evolution of consciousness, and it's going to happen in each human being and the collective. There's been so much that have changed in the past 5 years that many people have noticed that they're in an entirely different landscape than they were before, surrounded by different people, maybe a different job, maybe different values. So, we're still in the midst of the aftermath of processing how much real change happen. Like if you think of like the butterfly effect, for example, of like this idea that like a butterfly flapping its wings can like create a tornado in like America. Now think of how immense a butterfly effect is because of how monumental these events have been. And I think that it's going to take us like decades to really even understand the depth of what happened. So, and also with this whole idea of AI, and obviously AI is going to be taking over the world. It already is. There is definitely a challenge of people replacing AI with their own thought processes. I even saw a guy who was one of the founders of the Google AI, or one of the engineers rather, and he said, AI can't do a couple things. It can't imagine and it can't intuit things. And that's literally what Rudolf Steiner talks about. How do you access higher worlds? Imagination, intuition, inspiration. And he also said that. So I found that was very interesting. So the thing is we are, in many ways, you know, people who become more reliant on this technology, outer technology, will probably retard their own inner technology that's already been going on, you know, but we also see this is also an aspect of actually what makes us human and separates us from machines. So it's not about rejecting technology and AI. It's about using it consciously and creatively in alignment with higher principles, and also understanding the limitations of it, to understand that developing your own mind, to develop your own process of inspiration, imagination, and intuition is actually extremely powerful, and you can create way more profound things with maybe AI or in conjunction with AI than you could alone. So it's not about rejecting technology, but using alignment with these higher principles, understanding its limitations, and understanding and having the conscious to also understand when it's potentially retarding you.
Yeah. You mentioned something when we talked about this the other day. You made a good point. Based on David Hawkins' map of consciousness, AI cannot possibly be above 400.
Yes.
400 is like the
reason.
Threshold of reason, of logical thinking, the ordinary mind, as it's in spiritual science.
Exactly. That was actually our friend Daniel who mentioned that to us. Okay. But basically it caps at the peak of reason. So it's like a very high IQ, reasonable friend, but it can't actually necessarily go into the 500, 600s, etc. So it's not about rejecting materialism, but spiritualizing it. It's not about retreating to the woods, trying to escape the world, going off grid, living as our ancestors did. You know, I think there's a genuine call to return to nature embedded in this kind of worldview, which is really what's created this spiritual vacuum as we become more and more disconnected with nature, with industrialism and the technological revolution, you know, to the point where people just sit in a cubicle, they go on their screens all day, they don't spend any time outside with the land, with nature. That's an issue. But then also, you know, you're going to cut yourself off from majority of the world if you don't understand kind of what's going on here. And we need to really just understand what we're going through in light of the larger evolution of consciousness that's going on. You know, I think about Pluto and Aquarius all the time. Pluto and Aquarius can be related to disconnection, dissociation, but it can also be related to individuation and the call to really connect to the true self. And that serves as the basis to what happens later, which is Pluto and Pisces, where we start to connect to the all. So to me, there's a larger part of the evolution of consciousness happening here. The technological revolution is going to be part of it. People will become further dissociated, disconnected from themselves. And also we're going to see these individuating micro communities rising up outside of it that are going to further fuel the evolution of consciousness. So the divine works in mysterious ways. We really need to see how the divine can work through everything, even disintegration too, yes, by the way. So even involution, which is the destruction of the previous form, is actually an aspect of evolution. So sometimes it feels like maybe perhaps humanity is regressing into a less soulful, heart-centered, connected way of living, but actually this is also a process of involution happening, which is also part of evolution. So we need to also zoom out as much as we can and try and look at the bigger picture.
Exactly. So everything really comes down as a teaching function, right? And it's not black and white, and it has its evolutionary purpose. So ultimately, those who align with truth, soul awareness, higher consciousness, they're sincerely engaged in psycho-spiritual work, right? To align with divine will, to align with the soul potential, the higher self. They'll be part of the next phase of human evolution, the seeds of the new world. But those who remain in the materialistic control, right, will struggle against the inevitable manifestation of the divine truth in the physical world. And they will, as Thomas Meyer said, in our recent podcast, they will kind of take it, quote unquote, detour, because ultimately, also in his view, and I agree, the materialistic control, the transhumanist control will collapse under the force of divine transformation, just like Atlantis collapsed, ancient Egypt collapsed. We talked about this with their abuse of technology and all that. But it will not collapse without a final effort to impose total mechanization and control on human life. And we also cannot just sit back and let God do his thing, so to speak. We need to play our part and actively, sincerely engage in the work, in this life, and be part of the transformation. So this concludes the first part. And the second part, again, for members, if you're not a member yet, you can sign up at my website, veilofreality.com/membership. You get access to all the second part. So in part 2, we'll dive deeper into the necessity of facing evil as part of transformation and what evil really is. We look into the deception disguised as light, the cosmic masquerade, be it in the New Age or the resurgence of dogmatic religious thoughts. And then ultimately we look into the presence of the divine forces, absolutely, and how they support us and guide us and assist us through this shift. And again, if you're interested in my new 10-week program, Mastering Spiritual Warfare, go to masteringspiritualwarfare.com. It runs from June 25th until August 27th, and it's limited to 40 people. Check it out and apply, and we'll be right back. Thank you.